In Afghanistan, the Taliban's crackdown on women.
None of these stories are getting out. The Taliban beat anyone caught filming something they don't like.
Undercover, correspondent Ramita Navai finds those who have been punished by the regime.
We covered some cases of women who were imprisoned. They were being held without charge.
And the defiant voices fighting back.
These women say they're risking their lives just by being here.
Now on Frontline, Afghanistan Undercover.
This program contains graphic content some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
As the Taliban took power in Afghanistan last year, I began working undercover there. The Taliban were promising to respect women's rights, but we started gathering evidence of women jailed by the Taliban without trial and held in secret. Of girls abducted from their homes and forcibly married. Of women living in hiding and in fear of their lives. With those speaking out, risking imprisonment.
صداست که میماند با نخ آوازت بدوز پرچم عصیان را.
This is the Afghanistan the Taliban don't want the world to see. I arrived in the country a few months after the Taliban seized power. There was already widespread fear among women, and signs that the Taliban were using their extreme interpretation of Islamic law to crack down on them. I traveled to the west of Afghanistan, where I'd heard accounts that young women were disappearing. Their families didn't know what had happened to them. In Herat city centre, Taliban fighters were patrolling the streets. The day before, they'd shot dead a doctor who failed to stop at a checkpoint. We keep hearing that Taliban intelligence is really strong here in Herat and that there are informants everywhere. So while everything seems normal, when you talk to people here, there's a real atmosphere of fear and mistrust. I was put in touch with the family of a woman who'd gone missing. Her brother met me on a side street and took me to meet the family. We agreed to call his sister Mariam and conceal her identity. Mariam had disappeared 3 weeks earlier. Her mother showed me pictures of her, graduating just before the Taliban takeover. Her dream was to become a film director.
خیلی دختر فعاله، خیلی دختر زبان‌آوره. همین که نشه کرتین حتی کرتین کنه پشت.
ببخشید.
خورد.
They've packed all her things away, and her mother broke down crying as she's going through her things now.
اما خداوند کمک کنه که من از این روز و از این سرگردانی نجات بفهم.
While we were in Herat, we heard of several other families with similar stories. We contacted a group of female lawyers who'd been investigating the Taliban's treatment of women in the city. They said they'd been hearing from their sources that the Istikhbarat, the Taliban intelligence service, was jailing women without trial for moral crimes, such as traveling without a male relative. The Taliban had banned the lawyers from working and were watching them, but they agreed to meet us in secret.
بس اینه که اینا اصلا این فکر میکنن که زن هیچ حقوقی نداره.
بر ورق استلام صادر میکنن حکم از مثلا میگه 3 ماه 2 ماه 5 سال 1 سال این حبس شه و این رو میبرن زندان. هیچ از اینا نه راجستر میشه به دیتابیس محاکم افغانستان و نه هم طی مراحل دادگاهی وجود داره.
These women say they're risking their lives just by being here, but they've come because they think it's important the world knows what's happening to women and girls in Herat. Mariam's family eventually received news of her.
Salam.
She was alive. She was being held in Herat Central Prison. The family received a letter from their daughter that was smuggled out of prison. Her sister read it out to us.
شیرین غیر از نامه دیگر هیچ راه ندارم همراه شما گپ بزنم.
Mariam said that some friends had been arrested for riding in a taxi without a male relative. She and one of the friends' fathers went to find them. Then she too was arrested for traveling without a male relative.
مرا در موتر برد. مرا در موتر امنیت ملی 3 نفر از ما بازجویی میکرد. هر دفعه دم برق میداد که راست بگم. موبایل مرا گرفتن بعد مرا آوردن محبس. مواظب همه باشین اینجا شب و روز خیلی سخت تیر میشه نگران شما زیاد هستم.
Mariam's family said they tried to see her in the prison but were turned away and told there was no record of her there. Without mentioning her name, we approached the prison ourselves to see if we could get inside and find out what was going on. A few days later, the Taliban sent their answer. We've been told we can film in the men's section, and when we're there, we're going to see if we can get permission to film in the women's section. The new Taliban prison chief, Mullah Muhammad Nabi Khalil, was waiting. He wanted to show us he was treating his prisoners well. Our tour of the men's wing began. He said there were around 700 male prisoners, mostly charged with theft or murder. Eventually, the prison chief agreed to take us to the women's section. where he told us over 90 women were being held.
We're about to enter the women's prison, and he's already told me that we can't interview any of the prisoners on camera. I'm going to see if I can chat to them.
Using a hidden camera, I started to film. Around 40 women were huddled in a courtyard.
سلام. کسی با من حرف میزنه؟
کمک بابا میتونه شما بکنه.
شما کی شما رو گرفته؟ کی گرفتن؟ برای چی؟ چه جرمی؟ ها؟
به جرم فساد اخلاقی.
فساد اخلاقی؟ کی گرفتن؟
3 ماه پیش.
3 ماه پیش. دولت؟
نه همین دولت.
همین دولت؟ بیشتر؟
هیچ رسیدگی به ما نمیشه. نه جرم.
آها.
ما میفهمم اصلا ما چیزی گفته نمیتونیم.
دوسیه شما رسمی ثبت شده؟
محکمه نمیشه. 4 ماه 3 ماه محکمه نمیشه.
محکمه یعنی
اصلا ما رسیدگی نمیکنه. اینا چه بندیش نه.
اما طفلای شیخوری افماییم به خانه 8 تا طفل شیخور خانه کرایی گشنه و دشنه میشن.
Then I spotted a young woman I recognized from the photographs her mother had shown me. It was Mariam.
How are you doing?
I spoke in English so the guards wouldn't understand.
Why have you been taken?
21 days.
And what for? What crime?
They don't let us to speak. When we speak, they will punish us, okay? So just say to all the world that they don't let us to go.
Okay.
So
A female prison guard told Mariam to stop speaking English. After the reprimand, she started praising the Taliban.
همراه ما خیلی رابطه خوب داره. دیگه شکر کل چیز عالیه.
Okay.
دیگه برادرای مجاهد ما هم خوب هستن شکر. Bless you.
Great to speak to you.
Thank you so much.
Mariam and the other women I spoke to in the prison had all told me similar stories and had confirmed what I'd been hearing in my reporting, that the Taliban were jailing women without trial for everything from leaving their husbands to traveling unaccompanied.
As soon as I saw her, I recognized her from the photo that the family have shown me. Everyone I spoke to told me they'd been imprisoned for immorality since the Taliban took power.
Mariam's family would continue their efforts to get her home. In Afghanistan's capital, we continued our reporting. We found an underground network of young women running secret safe houses. They were helping other women and their families escape the Taliban.
با تمام کیس‌ها رسیدگی میکنیم به شکل یعنی پنهانی براتون بگویم. ما با فامیلایی که یعنی جانشان در خطر هستند مکان برشان امن‌تر انتخاب میکنیم.
Around this time, hundreds of people the Taliban accused of being linked to the previous government were being detained or even murdered, including female police officers, lawyers, and journalists. The women in the network were themselves on the run from the Taliban. While I was with them, they were checking on families they were helping.
Hello?
بله سلام علیکم.
That's fast, I'm not feeling safe.
The women told me that many of the families they work with want to leave Afghanistan. The women let me join them as they rushed to meet a new family who'd just fled from a northern province. They fled the Taliban and they're on their way to Kabul now. They don't know anyone here, they've got no money, and they need help. They headed to the outskirts of the city. To make sure they weren't followed, they changed taxis several times. They met the family in a room near a bus station. Aisha, her husband and 4 children had traveled 15 hours. They'd abandoned their possessions and had nowhere else to go. They were taken to a safe house. Aisha had been a radio journalist, and although the Taliban had pledged there'd be a free press, she said that in her town they'd been threatening and harassing local journalists. She went into hiding, and the week before she fled, the Taliban had stepped up their search for her and other journalists.
از اون خاطر وقتی که زمان ما در خانه شته بودیم شنبه شب بود که بر ما کس زنگ زد که برین تلاشی خانه به خانه شروع شده.
She showed us pictures of her brother that she said were taken after the Taliban tortured him, trying to get him to say where she was.
ببینین سیخ داغ کرده بر. این کار کس با حیوان نمیکنن یا با انسان میکنن. از خاطر چی؟ از خاطر که من ژورنالیست هستم. گفتن تو برو شاید خورتا پیدا کنی که ما از پشت تو تعقیبی براین.
آها، یعنی برادر شما رو سینجین کردن از شما پرسیدن. از برادرتون. برادر شما
برادرم گم است. مرده زنده هیچ چیز ما.
Despite the Taliban's crackdown, some women in the capital were openly challenging the regime. We came across a demonstration, which I filmed with a hidden camera. One of the Taliban's first actions was to close the Ministry of Women's Affairs, describing it as having no function. These women had worked there and were demanding their jobs back. My colleague Kareem Shah filmed from the fringes of the protest. But agents from the Taliban intelligence service arrived, taking his camera and threatening to arrest him. The protesters scattered and we drove off before we could be detained.
Let me talk.
Okay.
We've been in touch with quite a few women protesters here in Kabul. But the same thing keeps happening. We arrange to meet them and they pull out because the Taliban get to them, see them at protests and the threats start. But there's one women's group who continue to meet and they're allowing us to join them at a secret meeting tomorrow. In the past few months, this group had organised many protests, demanding that the Taliban keep its promise to allow girls to attend school. They were the first women we met willing to show their faces on camera. Before the Taliban took over, Lena was a lawyer.
اما یک باره همه چیزت ازت گرفته شوه، نه دفتر باشه نه دیوان باشه، هیچ چیزی برات وجود نداشته باشه و کلاً در 4 دیواری خانه مثل همو بندیایی که قضایشان پیش بردیم مانند از اونا خود ما هم فعلا شدیم.
Wahida was a librarian.
عدلی و قضایی اجازه داشتن، وکیلای مدافع بود، سارنوال بود، همه حق و حقوقشان گرفته شده. هیچ چیزی نمانده برای خانما.
Arifa had been about to open a restaurant.
اینمی کلش خطرات است که ما تا به مقصد میرسیم، ولی من مطمئن هستم که اسامی ما، چهره های ما و پیش استخباراتشان هست و چی امروز چه فردا و دنبال ما هستن و ما رو خواد گرفتن و ای که با ما چی خواد کردن ای رو من نمیدانم.
The group was meeting to decide whether to continue with the street protests. Just that week, the Taliban had been warning women to stop protesting or face arrest.
به نتیجه میرسیم که اعتراض خیابانی خطرش بالای 90% است.
برچند تقریبا یک ماه دیگه باید نریم.
نه تنها طالبا بالای ما محدودیت وضع کردن، حتی سوی خانواده ها ما در تهدید هستیم. برادر با ما مشکل داره، پدر با ما مشکل داره، اجتماع با ما مشکل داره و ایده محدود ما بودیم که کار کردیم و صادقانه به خاطر تحقق عدالت اجتماعی.
In Herat, there were developments with Mariam. Using their connections, her family had been negotiating for her release. While we were with them, there was a breakthrough. Her mother was just standing at the house gates waiting for her daughter. Finally, Mariam and her mother were reunited. Her friends had also been released and were with her. She told us that when she was detained, a Taliban officer took her phone.
مو اسناد تمام مدارک مردید، هم سنفیای مردید مرا دوزد گفت تو اگر مشون فاحشه نباشی، تو اگر این رقم نباشی، تو چرا امروز بچه ها یک جای عکس گرفتی؟ 2 بار 3 بار دم برق داد، تفنگ شلاق مشک کرد، سرم گرفت، گفت راست بگو.
The other girls said they were tasered and beaten too.
من زیاد من قسمت دستم که تالو حساسیت کردم، شوک برقی دادن.
شوک برقی؟
دم در که ما را در زندان تحویل دادن، اونجا طالبا گفتنی 4 نفر هم شلاق بزنین، هم 4 اتاق جداگانه ببرین.
ما پتو نداشتیم زیر خود بندازیم، از دست سردی نه جواب خواب میرسیم، نمیفهمیدیم روز حتی وقت نماز هم نمیفهمیدیم که این نماز بخونیم.
They said other prisoners told them they'd also been jailed without any investigation or trial.
یک خانم دیگر به خاطر شکایت برده بود از هوای سرد در یک میله وسط زندان، دست و پایش زنجیر
داخل اولی بسته کرده بود.
Mariam and her friends said while in prison, Taliban officers made them an offer.
ما 4 نفر اول گرفته بودن، میگفتن اگه با 4 تا مجاهد نکاح کنین شما را از اینجا آزاد میکنیم. و ای که دخترای دیگه ای را ما آورده بودن، 2 تا دختر تقریبا 5-6 روز بعد از ما آورده بودن، اونا را مجبور کرده بودن که نکاح کنن، با طالبان نکاح کنین تو ما شما را از اینجا آزاد.
از بس که طالبان سر ما ظلم کردن، ما از مردای عادی و حتی از خانواده‌های خود میترسیم چون اونا مردن.
Just as we were leaving, one of the women took me aside and told me they are now marked women, that the families are blaming them for dishonouring the community and that nobody will marry them. She also says that none of those women can leave their homes, not just because they're scared of the Taliban, but because they're scared of their neighbours. They've gone from one prison to another. We drove north to Badakhshan province, through the Salang Tunnel and the Hindu Kush Mountains. We were hearing allegations that Taliban fighters were forcing young girls into marriage there, despite the regime publicly proclaiming that the practice was forbidden.
Salam alaikum.
Faizabad was one of the last northern cities to fall to the Taliban in 2021. Fighters who'd once been holed up in the mountains now controlled the streets. While we were in Faizabad, we obtained this video. Taliban fighters have tied a man to a tree and are beating him with rifle butts. I found someone who was there, who told me the victim had witnessed a Taliban commander abducting a girl for marriage.
We're hearing so many stories of Talibs forcefully taking girls and women as brides. And it's not just the foot soldiers doing this. So far, we've heard of cases involving a police chief, some top commanders, and even an official working in the governor's office.
حتی بعضی خانه‌های کثیفی است که همدست به اینا هستند. پور برادر خودم مثال میتن.
A wealthy businessman met with us secretly. He said a few weeks earlier, his 19-year-old cousin had been forced to marry a powerful Taliban commander, 40 years older than her.
با اصطلاح از نگاه اقتصادی وضعشون خوب بود، زندگیشون خوب بود و دیگه دختر کم خوشگل بود.
The Taliban commander, he said, had arrived at the girl's home with some of his men and demanded her father's consent.
در گوش سالار ماندم، ایرالات کوب کردن. ریختن خون انسان مثل که یک گلاس آب بریزونی ارزشش اینه مقدار است پیشش. یا حادثه غم انگیز و غمگین کننده یا حادثه از او کنه و دختر میکشتن خوب بود.
Those who have witnessed such forced marriages and abductions say they follow a pattern.
در بازار میرن میبینن دخترای مقبول میپرن پرسان میکنن که دخترها کی است، مادر پدرش کی است، فامیلش کی است. وقتی که دختر روزی نباشه، مادر پدرش روزی نباشه، خب زور از که میبرن دختره و یا رو اختار میتن میکشن کسی بگه نه.
This man agreed to talk to us if we concealed his identity. He himself had a confrontation with a group of Taliban who were taking a girl for forced marriage.
اینا دیگه سوالی پرسان نکردن، ما را مورد شلق زدن لطکوب کردن دیگه وشی واره. این گپا زیاد است. مردم صدای خود کشیده نمیتونه، مردم میترسه. چطور مردم صدای خود بلند کنه؟
What's striking about being in the countryside is that we're hearing so many stories of abuse at the hands of the Taliban, but none of these stories are getting out. The area is remote, journalists have fled, and the Taliban beat anyone caught filming something they don't like. Under the Taliban, around half of Afghanistan's media outlets have closed. But in Faizabad, Radio Sadao Banawan, the voice of women, was still on air.
در امان باشین. خیلی زیاد خوش آمدین به برنامه سفره شورچای از بانوان FM. با ما هم امروز
The station was founded and run by women, but now only men were in the studio.
رئیس صاحب اطلاعات فرهنگ ولایت بدخشان را با خود داشته باشیم. معزالدین احمدی در برنامه مهمان ما هست. سلام علیکم، خیلی زیاد خوش آمدین رئیس صاحب به برنامه.
علیکم السلام و رحمت الله و برکاته. سلامت باشید.
The first caller into the program was a journalist from the radio station itself, asking the Taliban information chief when she'd be allowed back to work.
اگر خواهری که بخواهد کاری در رسانه ها انجام بدهد با پوشش حجاب اسلامی و همو قوانین امارت اسلامی را رعایت نموده انشاءالله هیچ مشکلی نیست و این خاطر ما مجاهد تربیت کردیم، مجاهدی که واقعا تثقیف شده هستند، مشکلاتی انشاءالله با جامعه ندارن. انشاءالله مجاهدی ما هرگز مرتکب چنین جرمی نخواهد شد.
خب تماسی ولی سلام بر شما.
یکم سیاتم خوب نبود شد درست پس خم نگفته شد در طرف
Later, when the station was off air, we returned to meet its founder and head, Nadia Saroush.
هلو
ناجیه جان سلام.
سلام علیکم، شما خوب هستین؟
خیلی بفرمایید. مرسی.
The Taliban had banned Nadia from the office when men were present, citing Islamic law. She said they'd been pressuring her to resign and that she'd been receiving anonymous death threats.
چند درصد، چند تا از خانمای خبرنگار کارمند خانم برگشتن سر کار.
و تو هنوز هیچ کس برنگشته. اینجا اتاق نشین من ما بود، اینجا نان میخوردیم، اینجا دخترها همگی میشیشت.
The Taliban had told her women could no longer host phone-in shows in case they inflamed the passions of male callers.
قبلا بود ما برنامه آهنگ داشتیم، موزیک بود، دخترها لایف گپ میزدن، تماس داشتن، خنده میکردن. قبلا بود یک دخترم را یک پسر بسیار مذاق میکردن، جوکینگ میکردن، اما حالی نمیتونیم.
A few days later, Nadia would flee Faizabad. After being released from prison in Herat, Mariam had contacted the underground women's network in Kabul. We filmed as they met Mariam outside the airport. Her brother and younger sister had come too. The guys have just arrived at the emergency safe house. They're going to stay here for the next few days until they find them a more permanent safe house to live in, and they're going to now debrief them. شما چرا خونه رو ترک کردی؟
چرا که کلی مردم طرف ما یک قسم میبینه مذهبی تر هسته. اونا حتی با بعضی فامیلا گفته بودن که شما آبروی شهرک ما را بردین، لطفاً از اینجا کوچ کرده برین.
حالا چی؟ آینده حالا چطوره؟
ما اصلا نمیفهمم کدوم آینده. فعلا کلی چیز یعنی سردرگم، ما چیزی یعنی هیچ روزنه، هیچ امیدی، هیچ روشنایی رو نمیبینم.
زنگ میزنن مختار میدم.
In Mariam's safe house, there was another woman on the run with her daughter and grandchild. She'd been a major in the Afghan army before the Taliban took power. Now, she said, they were searching for her and other former military officers. While we were with her, her brother sent footage of his arrest and torture by the Taliban.
یک روز زنگ زدن که ما شما را پیدا میکنیم به هر جایی که باشی آخر هر وقت باشه پیدا میکنیم بچه‌هایتون میکشم خودتون زیاد تشویش داریم دروازه تک تک میشن خودم میریم دروازه میگم یک زن طالب بود که طالبا بالا شدن.
Winter was taking hold, making it harder to travel. We decided to leave and return in the spring to find out what had happened to some of the women we'd met and to put what we'd found to the Taliban. Back in the capital, the Taliban agreed to an interview at a new government ministry.
So this used to be the Ministry of Women's Affairs. Now it's Ministry of Vice and Virtue. When we were here last 3 months ago, all these blast walls were covered with beautiful murals depicting women and slogans about women's rights, and now the only thing on them are these posters telling women how to dress.
Hundreds of women used to work here. On my visit, I was the only woman in sight. The spokesperson for the Ministry of Vice and Virtue is Akif Mahajer.
Salam alaikum. خوشحال شدم.
Please cover your hair.
Mahajer. Why did Vice and Virtue take over the Ministry of Women's Affairs?
د خزو په نوم باندې یو ځانګړی وزارت دغوی په نوم کول دا د خزو سره تبعیضي چلند ده چې د خزو په نوم باندې یو وزارت دي نو پیدا معلومیږي چې نور ټول وزارتونه د سړی او یوازې دغه یو وزارت.
Why are you concentrating on women? Because I noticed when I walked into the building, there were posters telling women how they should dress. I haven't seen any for men.
زموږ اصلي هدف زنانه نه دي خو بهجابي داسې یو مرض ده چې ټولنه کې متعدي امراضو څخه ده د نورو بېلارۍ او د نورو فساد ته لار هواروي.
Should the responsibility not be on men to behave properly here? Why should the responsibility be on women?
خزو هزار وضعیت جنسي وو په لاره کې بې لارې الوکان به جنکۍ ته ولاړو کیسې وې چې اوس د هغو ټولو مخه نیول شوې ده هېڅ نارینه نشي کولی چې یوې ښځینه ته د ازار ورسوي.
I asked him about the accounts we'd uncovered of women being arrested for so-called crimes of immorality.
هلته په بېحجابي باندې د ښځو په بد اخلاقي باندې فساد اخلاقي لپاره کار کېده کېدای شي تاسو له هغو ښځو سره خبره کړي چې په تېر 20 کلن اشغال کې رالویې شوي او له غربي کلتور نه له غربي افکارو نه له غربي نظریو څخه متاثره وي هغو سره تاسې مخ شوي هغوی به ویر لري که نه عموما په افغان ټولنه کې افغان ښځې کله هم له هغه څه نه ویره نه لري چې هغه اسلام وایي.
The ministry would soon issue new restrictions on women, including one ordering them to cover their faces in public. We returned to Herat, where we'd seen the women in prison. The situation for women here was increasingly dire. At Herat Regional Hospital, I met Dr. Shahnaz Piruz.
جراحی پلاستیک سوختگی پلاستیک سرجن البته همراه با برنه باز بیشتر مریضا ما برنه که خانما خیلی فیصدی بالای خودسوزی داریم همین الان هم ما داخل بخش خودسوزی داریم. با اذیت کنی نون خورده میتونی.
The patient was named Hiba. She was being treated for burns after setting herself on fire.
میتونی حرف بزنی؟ تو شبی که یه اتفاق افتاد چه کار شد؟ شبی که خودسوزی کردی؟ گفت برو خود بسوزون. بندازون لرزه گرفته استرس داره. الان گرمم میشه خوب و روشنه.
The Taliban had closed shelters that once helped women in violent marriages, like Hiba. Hers was the second self-immolation case in the ward in just 2 weeks.
همونطور که گفتم نظر به فشارهای روانی که در خانه ها بیشتر شده رو خانم ها و ای که دیگه حال نمیتونن ادعایی بکنن و هر جایی که زیر سوال برن دیگه هیچ حرفی زده نمیتونن چون قانونی وجود نداره اونطوری که خانم ها ماین.
Hiba died a month later. Many other suicide cases are treated in the main hospital wing.
This gentleman saw that we were filming. He approached us to say that his daughter has attempted suicide. He said he wants to meet her.
آقا چه اتفاق شد؟ چی شد اینجا؟
این که عرضی کردم.
بله.
از اون شروع شد زدن، خان انداختن، در قرف، لط و کوب، آخر به این رو.
Nuria had drunk bleach and was in constant pain.
سلام. واقعا ببخشید.
فقط میگم مواد بخورم. سلام. چون میزدم ماله میگفت بزن خب معمل میزدم شعار من بخورم بزن
Nuria's mother said she knew of several other girls in their village who'd recently tried to kill themselves. Off camera, the hospital administration said that while they are seeing suicide cases, the numbers have gone down under the Taliban. But several doctors who were too frightened to speak openly told us hospital records were inaccurate. One doctor agreed to an interview if we concealed her identity and her voice.
کیسی که مربوط به خود طالب باشه راجستر نمیشه. این خب مثلا خشونت‌های فامیلی بوده یا ازدواج‌های اجباره بوده و یا اینقدر نبوده که حیثیت طالب زیر سوال ببره. کیس‌های زیاد هسته.
حول و حوش چند تا از موقعی که اینو قدرت گرفتن؟
بین 30 تا 50 کیس باشه. زیاد هسته. مریضی‌های مخفی هیچ دوسیه نداره.
In the burn unit, Dr. Piruz and her colleague, Dr. Mehri, had spent the day operating on patients. For now, despite the Taliban's crackdown, they're allowed to work alongside men because the country is short of surgeons.
اگه ما این کار نکنیم مریضا چی میشه؟ به خصوص طفلکا خانم ها که نیاز دارن.
و ما هم نیاز داریم که فعالیت خودخور داشته باشیم. و مریض ما نیاز داره، مخصوصا بچه زنانه به خانم ها نیاز دارن. و یک احساسی به ما میده که باید مقابله کنیم.
تعداد نظامی‌های طالبان در خود شهر کابل بیشتر شدن. تلاشی های خانه به خانه کردن. حتی از زمون محلی خود ما میترسم که گویا فکر میکنم اینا هم همدست با طالب هستن یا.
When I'd last met Arifa, she'd been organising protests demanding schools reopen for girls. Two of her colleagues, who I'd also met, had since been arrested and jailed by the Taliban. Wahida and Lena had been forced to make false public confessions, saying they'd been paid by foreign governments.
کسی که این پروسه را اندازی کرده بودن در امریکا هستن.
این ویدیو رو شما دیدین چی احساس کردین؟ رفیقای دوستای همکارای شما رو شما روی این ویدیو دیدین؟
میفهمیدم که اینا غلط است. اینا چی هست که طالبان میگه، خاص طالبان است، کلمات طالبان است، ولی باز هم گفتنش از دهن دخترایی که جان به کف 6 ماه مبارزه کردن به خاطر تحقق عدالت، شخصا برای من بسیار سنگین تمام شد.
At a safe house in the city, I found Mariam again. She was still in hiding, hoping to find a way to get out of Afghanistan.
آینده تو الان چجوری میبینی؟
اگر نتونیم افغانستان رو ترک کنیم مجبور هستیم در گوشه از یک جایی بشینیم بپسندیم. اگر به امی شکل به امی منوال حکومت به امی منوال باشد یک روزانه اینیه که ما ببینم همه تاریکه.
I'm waiting to see Bilal Karimi. He's the deputy government spokesperson. And I want to put some of the allegations we've been hearing to him. Hello, سلام. خوشحال شدم. خیلی ممنون.
یک چیز است که اگر شما خفا نمیشین که تصویر ما با همین خواهر نبیایه.
یعنی شما جدا از جدا؟
نه، از هیچ نبیایه، از ما بیایه، از همو بیایه. یه باید این خواهر خوب بفهمانیم که این حساسیت شخصی ما با اون نیست.
کار دولتی.
بله.
We covered some cases of women who were arrested and imprisoned for immorality, and their cases were not officially registered. They were being held without charge.
یک کسی که متهم باشه به یک جرم او باید تحقیق شوه، بررسی صورت بگیره. اما هر زمان اگر او براءت پیدا کنه بس خب میره به خانه خود، کسی به او غرض نداره. و اگر جرم سر ثابت شوه بس به حکم محکمه و سر او فیصله میشه که حکم تطبیق شوه.
I've spoken to young women who told me that when they were arrested, Taliban officers used tasers to electrocute them.
شاید تعداد زیادی از کسایی یافت شوند که همچو اداره بکنند، ولی مقاصدی شاید در پشت سر دیگر داشته باشند، ولی این اسناد شده نمیتونند.
I've also spoken to former female prisoners who've said that some prisoners were told if they married Talibs, they would be released. Will you investigate that?
کذب محض است، را قابل تفسیر هم نمیدانم.
I've spoken to some families who've told me that Talibs are forcefully marrying women and girls. Why is this happening?
ما که بر دیگر مردم میگوییم که شما باید اصول اسلامی را عملی بسازید و هیچ اجازه نمیدیم که افرادی ما تو یک چیز عملی زشت را انجام بدهند. آنها نباید توقع داشته باشند که چیزهایی را تحمیل نمایند که از خود آنها است. ما با خود فرهنگ داریم، منافع داریم، ارزش‌ها داریم. فعلا آنها گذاشته شوند که یک نظام از خود جور کنند.
International Women's Day. The Taliban had set up extra checkpoints across Kabul. Arifa and her group told me they hope to stage a demonstration. They're having problems leaving their homes. One of them left a voice message to tell me that there were 2 Talibs right on her street. So the Talibs do not want women protesting today. In the end, the women decided to avoid the streets. They still wanted to get their message out.
این ریسک خیلی بزرگیه که شما الان دارین میگیرین که امروز اینجا اومدین. نمیترسی که شما رو دستگیری کنن، زندانی کنن؟
ولی این رسالت است و این راهی هست که ما انتخاب کردیم. من که 3 تا خواهر از خودم خورد دارم، اگه من به خاطر اونا صدا بلند نکنم اونا هم شکستن. فقط ابراز خوشحالی میکنم که ما در فضایی که همگی ما میدانیم چقدر برای ما محدود است و شرایط سخت داره.
Arifa had brought with her a work by the poet Muhammad Sharif Saidi, written for the women of Afghanistan.
شب است و داد بزن بانو، سکوت سرد سترون چیست؟ صدا صداست که میماند، دلیل حنجره بستن چیست؟ با نفع آوازت بدوز پرچم عصیان را. می جنگم، مبارزه میکنم، تبریک میگم به امیدی افغانستانی برابر، افغانستانی شکوفا و افغانستانی که زن به عنوان انسان شناخته شود. سلامت.
Go to pbs.org/frontline to read more about the treatment of women under the Taliban.
Should the responsibility not be on men to behave properly here? Why should the responsibility be on women?
And to explore all of our reporting on Afghanistan, visit the complete Frontline archive, where you can stream more than 300 documentaries. Connect with Frontline on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and stream anytime on the PBS Video app, YouTube, or pbs.org/frontline. For more on this and other Frontline programs, visit our website at pbs.org/frontline. Frontline's Afghanistan Undercover is available on Amazon Prime Video.